The thing is, I'm doing this, what we're going to call a podcast, from Bozeman, Montana. And the thing about that is, although there are 50,000 people here, to include the people at the university, it's still a remote little place. And for me, it's really not big enough to fulfill my needs and desires and destiny. It's not. I've been here for 14 years raising kids, and that chapter is kind of closing for me, and I'm headed back to New Mexico. I'll be honest, I miss LA. I lived in LA for 3 years. I miss the place. And I just, that traffic situation, that daily grind. And if I went back, I'd be going for auditions. I'd be, playing the game and paying that rent. And, the thing about Los Angeles is it is one of the most amazing places. There is a love. When you wake up in Los Angeles on the right mornings, there is a feeling of love and abundance and beauty that I really haven't experienced in other cities ever. Now, I've had amazing times in New Mexico at times, especially up in Taos, northern New Mexico, where Julia Roberts lives, and 6,000 other people and 2 million visitors a year, or whatever it is. But so every place, every geographical, every place has its gift, right? But the thing about Bozeman, Montana is the winters are 7 months long, and that's not pulling any punches at all. That's, at least 7 months of winter. And although the summers are absolutely gorgeous, and you can ski here for cheap too. It's way cheaper than New Mexico or, Aspen or anything like that, Colorado. Way cheaper. Like you can get a lift ticket you can get a half day for about $45, and I think a whole day for $63 or something like that. It's cheap. But just if you're not doing that, and I don't do that often enough to sort of substantiate my being here. There are a lot of winter athletes who train here in Bozeman. But in the summer you can fish and camp all over Montana. You can go down to the park, Yellowstone, go to Glacier National Park. I like Glacier better than Yellowstone. And then there are beautiful lakes in northern Montana. You can really, the state motto is get lost. You can get lost in Montana. But between those beautiful places, it is flat as a pancake and dull as a board. And, like so many other, and I'm picking on Montana because I've lived here and kind of have the right to bitch about this place. And finally, I'm leaving. I'm very happy to be leaving. Joe Rogan used to come up. He talks about Bozeman specifically on his podcast, and he used to come up here with Anthony Bourdain. And they would visit this writer, or at least Bourdain would, this writer Jim Harrison, in the next town over, which is called Livingston, which is kind of the artist-writer enclave of this area. The problem with Livingston is it's between two mountains, perfectly situated to be a wind tunnel, and when the wind starts to blow over there, you can't hear yourself think. You can't go outside, and it's insane. But artists and writers lock themselves up inside and do their thing, which is probably what I should have done. I should have moved to Livingston at some point, but I didn't. Anyway, and I've done a lot of painting here in Montana and a lot of writing here in Montana. What I haven't done, I did, like so many people, I did comedy when I was young, back in the early 90s to late 90s. And then, I moved back to New Mexico and started painting, and I started a family and, moved around and went to Dallas for 5 years, worked for Chase, what's now Chase, and then moved moved to Montana to get back to the mountains. But the thing about Bozeman is it's never, it's not New Mexico. If you've ever lived in northern New Mexico, especially Santa Fe and Taos, you can't duplicate that. You can get other kind of highs by living in parts of Arizona, parts of Colorado. Colorado is a wipeout in terms of those gigantic mountains and, the grandeur of Colorado and Alaska, for instance. In a way, though, those are too much for me. It's way too wigged out. Those Colorado Rockies are massive, up there near, in back of Telluride where Tom Cruise has a place, and, these people go to hide and, live in these, massive, they're not McMansions, they're mansions, but they're made out of huge trees and concrete. It's beautiful, but it's almost like it's just a little too much, It's a little too much for me. It is. Anyway, so I'll be getting out of these northern climes and going back down to the southwest, and I'll set up a permanent studio when I get there. But, I'm not going for some little while, and I wanted to kind of get things rolling in terms of a podcast, or whatever you call it. What's the difference between a podcast and a radio show and a TV show and and pointing a camera at somebody and having them talk? What is the morning show? What's the difference? What is the difference? Ultimately I don't think there's a lot of difference. Usually a podcast would have more than one person, but again, there's no one around here. And if I brought another person in, the chances of them being interesting at all, not going to happen. It's not going to happen. It might, but that's not going to happen. So, not to me. So, the one thing I was thinking about is how many people are podcasting. And, on one level you think about it in a competitive way, like, well, then, if X to the N are podcasting, there's going to be less time for people to pay attention to me, speaking, of anyone who's decided to do it. On the other hand, I think that this is one of the modes for the day, and I think the Joe Rogan Experience, kind of dropped a bomb on it in terms of, like, this is how it ought to look, and this is how it ought to be. And, there's general agreement about that, because so many people, a couple of million at least, tune in every day, and, that probably goes up. People dig it because it's relaxed. It's like a radio show, but he has good people on, and there's just something about setting it up correctly and then having a relaxed format that is, and a long format. It's 3 hours. There's something about that is totally appealing to people. And, when somebody's got it right, and when somebody's got it wrong. People talking into their computers and posting it on YouTube, it's not, unless the person is absolutely captivating, and some people are, actually. But unless they're absolutely captivating, to look at someone who's, turned on a camera on their laptop, it sucks, So there is a happy medium, and I wonder how many people and groups of people who have duplicated what Joe Rogan did. The first one is Joey Diaz, who is one of Joe Rogan's oldest friends. If you watch his podcast, dude, he's got the brick wall and the table, and it looks and feels. And he's got this kid Lee, what's his last name, Syart or something, working for him in exactly the same capacity as Jamie on JRE, right? Joe Rogan, except that Lee eats these edibles from the pot store, from the marijuana store, constantly. So he's nodding in and out while he's while on air, you know. He's kind of supposed to be checking things, you know, online, but he's completely unconscious some of the time, you know. And not to knock Joe Diaz for copying Joe's format for his studio, the look of his studio, nor, you know, the format for the podcast. Not to knock him, because, you know, what's wrong with success? I get the feeling that he did that specifically because it worked for Joe, right? I'm going to take a break and be right back. So, I wonder if I can do this. I'm still experimenting. Just with setup to see what's going to work and what's not going to work. But, you know, okay, so, and I apologize if you're not familiar with the Joe Rogan Experience, if you're not familiar with that podcast and the offshoot podcasts that have happened since he started that by his friends and other people, you know, then I apologize. But some of the subject matter will feed. So one of the things that got me about Eddie Bravo, you know, is that when he would come on to the podcast and have strong opinions, then Joe would shut him down. You know, when he's talking about especially conspiracy theories, which is what Eddie likes to talk about. You know, that's what he does. He goes on YouTube and goes to the South End and, you know, and feeds on this stuff. You know, he consumes that content. But, you know, the thing about it for me was that Joe was shutting him down and negating these conspiracy theories, because Joe wanted to do that. And, you know, Eddie, whether or not, you know, but, you know, you talk about the moon, you talk about JFK, and Joe still talks. Joe had a podcast yesterday about JFK, another one, you know, and, you know, so it's okay for Joe, it's not okay for Eddie Bravo. And, you know, the reasoning behind it was, he said, well, if you talk about flat Earth, how many young people are listening to this podcast and they're going to believe that the Earth is flat? You're telling them that the last 500 years of, you know, scientific endeavor don't matter, and we're going back to the Dark Ages. Okay, so my thought on that is, first of all, if a 16 or 17-year-old kid wants to believe that the Earth is flat for a while, fine. I mean, it's not that big a deal. If they go on to believe that for the rest of their lives, even then, fine. I mean, it doesn't hurt the world that Eddie Bravo thinks that the world might be flat. But more to the point, constantly, everybody on the show is smoking pot on the podcast. How many young people are watching the Joe Rogan Experience and thinking, you know what, it's just fine to drink whiskey and smoke marijuana? Which, you know, for at a certain age, that is true. And it's Joe's podcast, and, you know, and that's part of the format, and it works because it's a bunch of guys sitting around having a little whiskey and a little, you know. But look what happened to Elon Musk for smoking pot on Joe Rogan. It's not just that kids are going to be, you know, influenced. Elon was influenced, and it cost him. It's the most expensive joint ever on planet Earth. So, you know, so people can't believe the Earth's flat, but they can smoke all the pot they want. It's just, you know, just a little bit like, you know. And I don't disagree with the pot smoking. I think that marijuana, mean, my thought is, and, you know, my whole posture is more power to you. You know, I do smoke pot sometimes. You know, I don't drink alcohol right now because I kind of wrote it off for New Year's. And, you know, it wasn't, you know, like a bottom out type of situation, hitting bottom. It was just, you know, I think I've had enough for a while, you know, or maybe for good. I don't know. I haven't put a cap on that, but, you know, but as far as marijuana goes, come on, the whole nation is going to be smoking pot soon. Within the next 5 years, all the states are going to fall, and it's going to be regulated, and you know, there'll be federal guidelines and all that kind of thing. It's coming. You know, I feel sure that that's happening. So, you know, and it's a natural plant, and the effects of what it does to the mind are multiplicitous and beneficial in many ways. Now, I have to say, if I smoke pot in the morning, I do not get as much done as I would if I just smoke it, you know, when the work is done. You know? But, you know, especially with CBD, all of the ingredients I think are beneficial. I do. So it's not the pot smoking on Joe Rogan that I'm talking about. What I am talking about is shutting down Eddie Bravo for being opinionated. And, you know, I wondered if it was because he was kind of hijacking the show and talking over Joe, or talking too long, or, you know, or any of that. In other words, is it a dick show? Is it ego? Or is it that Joe Rogan really believes that it's wrong to argue for a flat earth and other conspiracies, you know? And, you know, here's another weird aspect to this. And I hope these people watch this, because, you know, Joe Rogan went from believing the moonshots were bullshit and didn't happen and they were shot here, to believing that we actually went to the moon, but some of the footage may be from here, which is what I think. You know, I do believe that those astronauts went to the moon. I don't know, and you know, as far as the Van Allen belts, I don't know, you know. And as far as, you know, whether we really had the technology to make that little capsule go all the way to the moon, and no great problem. Of course, Apollo 13, they did have gas leaks. It was oxygen, yeah, leaking. Whatever. You know, Eddie's point is, you know, we have no idea what is true based on what we're told by the U.S. government and other entities, other you know, powerful secretive groups. We have no idea whether what they're telling us is true at all. And, you know, see, I side with Eddie. That's why I got pissed off. You know, I was listening to what Eddie said, and although I don't, you know, I moved on from the flat earth thing. There's some great arguments for that flat earth thing, which Joe didn't look into. You know, Joe immediately said, no, you know, it's so stupid that I'm not going to look at it. And, you know, I feel like Joe went from, you know, in with the sort of UFO alien trip, you know, went from an open mind to a more closed mind about it now. Maybe completely closed. And Eddie Bravo says on one of his podcasts, I think somebody got to Joe. And that's why he doesn't talk about it anymore, which is generally what I feel. And maybe even Joe doesn't even know that they got to him, because, you know, we're talking about technology after all. You know, it's just that he suddenly became disinterested in the subject, and you know, and negating it. And maybe he just doesn't want his podcast to be a conspiracy podcast, which I understand. But looking at the rich history of talk radio from, you know, even before Coast to Coast, you know, going back into the 70s, and then saying, I don't want to talk about, these, I mean, that stuff's like catnip, and then there's Bigfoot. Joe Rogan believed in Bigfoot because he got, what's his name from, what's that TV show where the guy goes out and lives in the forest for periods of time. That guy's convinced. I forget his name, and I really like that guy too. Convinced that he's seen Bigfoot on 2 occasions. Now Joe comes out and says, no, it's just not true. And, that one for me, I mean, personally, I've never seen a Bigfoot, and but I give the people, not the ones who go out and you hear a little creak in the woods and, they're getting up and grabbing their equipment because it's, they're all spooked. I think that is, an unfortunate byproduct of people who have had genuine experiences. And see, there's enough. You know what? I'm gonna take a break and come back into this in a little bit. There's enough evidence for some of this stuff that you can't write it off altogether. Be right back. So, I'll move this back just a bit. This podcast thing where they're comedians, every comedian in the orbit of Joe Rogan, everybody's got a podcast, and so many of them. And by the way, the podcasts are great. A lot of them are really great. I love watching Joey Diaz. I love watching Eddie Bravo. Bobby Lee is amazing, and his tongue-in-cheek whole thing where you can't tell whether he's serious or not, all the time, is comic genius and just genius, right? So they're good. These are good podcasts, that people are doing, and I don't know where the, it just started bubbling up, everybody doing it. I don't know if it was, attached to Joe Rogan doing it first and becoming wildly successful. I don't know, but they're good. And here's the second thing. And if you haven't watched Joe Rogan and others, then there's another side to it, which is that these aren't just comedians doing this. They almost all also practice martial arts. And so Joe Rogan met a lot of these guys doing martial arts, and I think he does judo, maybe jiu-jitsu, I'm not sure. And maybe he does MMA and everything, I'm not sure. But he's in the scene. He's been in the scene for a while. And for 25 years, at least. And he's been doing comedy for about that long too. So he talked a lot of these martial arts cats and wrestlers or whatever into doing stand-up. And they did, and a lot of them are successful. They're good. Which is just, it's weird, okay? There's this club of guys who are comedians and martial arts experts around the world. And they do both, and they all seem to hang out in LA with Joe Rogan, right? And with each other. So, so that's, such an odd, it's like chicken and waffles is such a weird thing to go together. And yet when you watch these people, you kind of get it because it's, especially the podcasts. I don't know about stand-up, but the podcast, because there's all these guys together. And you realize this thing of podcasting, all together, guy group, and wrestling and jiu-jitsu or karate, what, it's guys together. It's a bonding thing. So it, in a way, it's just this natural thing that fell together, maybe, and it makes me really wonder whether this was planned or not, and one thing is, I've seen these guys who are apparently, at the top of their game in judo or jiu-jitsu or karate or MMA or whatever it is, and I've seen them do comedy and I've seen their podcast. I haven't seen them do karate. I haven't seen that part of it. So it's just kind of a stunning coincidence that all of these people do those two things and got together, is very odd. And Joey Diaz, who weighed like 400 pounds his whole life, has done comedy next to Joe Rogan for the last 20, however many years, and he has lost some weight, and he's also doing jiu-jitsu or whatever, and has a podcast. Anyway, it's a whole thing is what I'm saying. It's a thing, right? And so, you may have seen Joe Rogan, but then you didn't realize that there's these offshoots. It's like, a comedy series where they, a couple of the characters go off and do their own thing, and it's successful. Whatever. And I guess, obviously, a podcast is a good way for a comedian to get known, and that way people will come to their shows when they go on the road. So, it's all logical and good. It's all logical and good. My thought for now is, to kind of talk about what they're talking about. Just to kind of, you can't call into their podcast. You can't show up and you can't call in, and they don't do, FaceTime or whatever and put you on the screen. So, to give so podcasts giving feedback to the other podcasts in the group is not a bad idea. And the reason I say that is because a lot of times the subject matter on these satellite shows is references what's on the original Mother Hive over at Joe Rogan Experience. So let's talk about Joey Diaz for a little bit. And the one thing about a comedian or anyone who's good behind a mic, on stage, whatever, is that these personalities are really disparate. They've got these things in common, and then but beyond that, they're incredibly varied souls. And Bobby Lee, for instance, and I don't think he does. It's kind of ironic. I think he's the one who doesn't do karate, but he's Asian, 100%. It's very hard to tell. He seems to pour his heart out all the time about sexual molestation and, all these things that have happened to him. But then, at the end of the story, you realize that he's probably been bullshitting you the whole time. And, he talks about, like letting people put their fingers in his ass since he was, and, in trade for candy for his whole life, and you realize at the end, like, nobody spends their whole life that way. It doesn't happen. So, anyway, but with Joey, when he pours his heart on his heart out on his sleeve, pours his heart out, you realize this shit really happened to Joey. And he's had such a painful life because he chose a life of crime from the time he was young. And his mother was a drug dealer. And then he started out as a criminal and got hooked on cocaine when he was 17 and did it till he was old, till he was 40, he quit about 10 years ago. But to hear him talk about his criminal past is incredibly interesting. And even if he wasn't funny, he's obviously very funny. And funny, it's his whole thing because he's got this gigantic face. And, at one point he was up to 450 pounds. Now he's down from there. But, he's a big man, And Cuban, but he looks like he's Italian, and he's got that look. and incredibly intelligent person also. And, you know, but to hear him talk about his cocaine exploits, you know, and kidnapping people and stabbing and, you know, beating people with boards and that kind of thing, and, you know, and going to prison and all this stuff, it's fascinating, and it resonates because, and one of the reasons it resonates, and I've been thinking about this, like, how much of your past do you want to lay out for people? You know, how much do you want to include that in your stand-up act? Or, you know, how, and, you know, how gritty do you want to get? How exposed do you want to be? You know, and watching people talk about their, you know, humbly spell out the things that they've done and been and failed at, and, you know, had done to them, you know, during these talks, these podcasts. And I, you know, kind of wish there was a better word for what they're doing, because I feel like what they're doing is sharing. It's a bonding thing, and they're bonding with their audience in a way that's, you know, very personal. But I say, you know, because, you know, Joey, Diaz, and Lee, they eat those edibles before they go on air. And I mean, they're so trashed, they're so fucked up when they're doing the show that, you know, he'll talk about anything, you know, and that's part of what Joey does is, you know, during his act, his stage act, you know, he talks a lot about shitting. You know, he's a huge guy, so he talks a lot about shit, you know, and, you know, the man seems to have had a lot of sexual experience. I mean, actually, every time he talks about his sexual experience, almost every time, I think, you know, he's always talking about how he was eating a girl's butthole. That's what he talks about, you know. And, you know, the first time I was like, okay, you know, then, okay. So I gotta sign off again, and we'll be right back. So we were talking before about how Joe Rogan used to come, and Anthony Bourdain used to come to Bozeman, Montana, I guess, to go fishing. And, you know, and I feel sure that Joe said, you know, if I had to live there all the time, you know, when it gets dark and cold, I just I'd be on the first plane back to LA, because, you know, it's just too much, right? But he also likened that feeling to how Bourdain might have felt when he decided he was going to be out of the picture. And, you know, I mean, now that we've had some time to kind of process that Bourdain thing, you know, we got some distance from it, because I think the whole world went into a state of shock, you know, about it. And I also think that you know, we've had a chance to consider it, and it seems to me that it had to do with his girlfriend. You know, I think her name is Asia Argento, the Italian, you know, daughter of an Italian filmmaker. I think it was her. I'm pretty sure. I hope I'm right about that. You know, and that she had some extra relationship, you know, affair or sex, which she thought that he was doing as well. She said as much. But when you go back and check out Bourdain's texts, or no, he was tweeting about it, and saying he was over the moon and I'm going to be with this girl for the next 1,000 years or whatever. And then he was shooting in France, went to Italy for 2 days, and came back to shoot with his partner. What's his name? The French chef. And everything seemed to be fine, but based on what happened, we can surmise it wasn't fine, and it was a result of having gone to Italy to see Asia Argento. And you wonder, like, I mean, was there a part of Anthony Bourdain that was so childlike, so young, so immature, really, that, you know, the idea of her sleeping with someone else was enough to push him over the edge when he could have slept with anybody. I mean, anybody. He could have had a relationship with anybody on the planet. And, you know, and he, but it was too much. And he didn't have the lateral view to see that it was not that big a deal, especially at his age, you know, which I think he was 62. You know, it's just a very strange thing, you know, and obviously he was totally in love, but he was in love like like, you know, first love, or like a kid, you know, so that when, you know, this tryst happened, you know, he thought it was a better idea. God knows what he thought, you know. And you know, he did confess to having really dark times. I think the alcohol. You know, there's so many people who are going clean and sober. You know, and you know, like some of the people who are in, you know, in that LA group of comedians, like Joey Diaz. Joey says, look, I was on cocaine for 10 years, straight, 11 years. And, you know, outlandishly so. And it ruined my life. And I did a lot of things I'm not proud of. But when I say sober, what I mean is I'm not going to do cocaine. But do I have an occasional drink? Yes. Do I smoke marijuana all the time? Yes. And edibles and everything else. And take mushrooms and LSD and whatever I want to. That's not my problem. My problem is cocaine. You know, and Bourdain had that same issue. He's like, you know, I was a heroin addict. I was a crack addict. You know, I did crack and heroin. Alcohol is not my issue. But in the long run, it seems, I would say, that alcohol was attacking his liver and his system such that he was constantly depressed and constantly battling depression, and that alcohol may have had an overwhelming effect towards that end. Now, you know, people are predisposed towards depression, and maybe that's why Anthony and, you know, all of us, you know, who have used alcohol and drugs to excess in our lives, maybe he was predisposed. He was depressive anyway, and that's why he used these substances, and it only made it worse. But that if he had laid off the alcohol, he still might have been overwhelmingly depressed. He still might have had this sort of, you know, fantasy idea about what a relationship is, such that, you know, when Asia tells him, I've had other men in my life, you know, it would be, you know, so crushing that, you know, life wasn't worth living. And remember, he's got a 10-year-old kid. That's where, you know, those things where, those times where things just come together in the most unbelievable way. So it wasn't just that we got hit with Bourdain's suicide. It was that we have to look at it and say, and he had a 10-year-old kid, and he was one of the most famous people on the planet, and he had all the money he could ever spend, and, you know, was this supreme personality that was so enjoyable to be around and, you know, sort of emulate and learn from and, you know, sort of laugh with. You know, it just, you know, it's like making a murder or something like that. You watch, if you've seen the Netflix, you know, thing on you know, that murder in Wisconsin, it just gets more unbelievable with every hour that you watch, you know? And it's like these things come together and nobody can decide, even his lawyers, even Steve Avery's lawyers, at having represented him for years, couldn't decide for sure whether he had done it or not. And, you know, this perfect whodunit with, I mean, every time there's new information introduced, it becomes more unbelievable. And that's kind of what happened with the Anthony Bourdain thing. You know, it's just like, and you wish, you know, we all wish we could just go and just talk to him long enough to point out the irrational nodes on his reasoning, so that once you dispel a few of those, this whole idea of suicide could go away, you know? Because, you know, I'm not the only one who thought, well, if you were miserable, why didn't you just go get some heroin and just go back on heroin for a while and kill the pain? Fuck it. I mean, you know, that's your history. Everybody would understand a relapse. What is unacceptable is suicide, right? My mother committed suicide. And two of my brothers, I had a brother die of heroin overdose, which I think was essentially a suicide, and I had a brother die of whiskey. At one point, my brother Joe went and bought a case of whiskey, big bottles, and he started drinking. And then it got to a point where he was lying down while he was drinking, and his back and the backs of his legs, his whole, you know, everything that was sort of on the couch, you know, turned black, completely black. His back, everything turned. And what had happened was he had so much whiskey in his bloodstream that all of those blood vessels were bursting inside his body, and the alcohol the blood settled into the back of his body and turned black because he was dying. It was necrosis. And he ended up going to the hospital and thought that the doctors were going to be able to help him, right? And they didn't come back with any answers or any positive anything. And, you know, he started picking up on this, like, they're not planning for me to live. And, you know, and that was true. You know, his organs were shutting down. And, you know, have you ever heard of anyone lying down and everything to the back just goes, for, you know, a couple of inches up, just goes black? Just goes black because it's dead. You know, that is black blood that is, you know, no longer red. It's just, you know, seeped out of his capillaries and it's turned black and he's dying.